Welcome back to our second segment of our discussion with Lieutenant Colonel Charles Harrison, United States Marine Corps retired, and the defense of Wake Island in December of 1941. Charlie, you'll recall when we finished our first segment, it was August 1941, when you and 169 fellow enlisted Marines from the 1st Defense Battalion, along with 5 officers, arrived off the USS Regulus. You offloaded there, which took about 3 days, and set up yourselves at Tent Camp 1. Now, before we proceed, if I can have that first slide, we need to remind our viewers of where Wake Island is, which is about 2,000 miles to the west of the Hawaiian group. And we should also point out that it's across the international date line. So your 9 or so day transit also meant that you lost a day as you were coming out to Wake Island.
Right.
Yeah. Also, when you arrived, there were 2 other entities that were located there on the island. One were the civilian workforce of the Morrison Knutson Construction Company.
Right.
Do you remember them?
Boise, Idaho.
Yes, out of Boise, Idaho. And their task was to build the advanced naval base for the Navy for PBY-type aircraft, and that meant constructing both the airfield that they use there, dredging the lagoon, putting in barracks, mess halls, hospitals, administrative spaces, and everything else for that naval air station that was to be located there. Some had been there as early as January of 1941. And the project manager, do you remember who that was?
Would that be Dan Teeters?
Dan Teeters.
Good
yes,
man.
A good man he was.
Highly respected, well-liked by everybody.
So they numbered about 950, I think, were still building when you arrived.
That's what I remember, yes.
And they were across the lagoon at what now became known as Camp 2. The second entity was the employees of the Pan American Airways Company.
Right.
And kind of going back for our viewers, if I can have those slides, Pan American, under the dynamic leadership of Juan Trippi, had established an uninterrupted trans-Pacific route, aerial route, flying from the west coast out of Alameda by way of Hawaii, and then by renting or leasing property from the Navy, was able to establish relay stations on Midway, Wake, Guam, and from there they could fly into Manila and ultimately on into Hong Kong. So they were covering, and the next slide please, they were covering about 8,000 miles in 6 days, and actually about 48 hours of flying time. And here, if you look up on your screen, you'll probably see one of the facilities there on Wake, and if I can have the next one. And in order to be able to compete with all the luxury of the steamship company, which still took 3 weeks to get out to the Far East, they had to provide luxurious service for the some 25 passengers in each of their Martin 130 China or Philippine Clippers flying ships, which they did. And so they had their location there also on Peel Island by the time you got there. I think there were about 27 employees. Now, the first task that you and your fellow Marines had to do was assigned to you by your acting commander, Major Hone. And that first task was to start putting out the heavy armament and weapons that you had moved ashore. And those consisted of the 3 batteries of 2 guns each of the Coast Artillery. And just to be able to, let's turn to the defense map, and I would like to have you confirm they had, I'm going to point out here, Battery A was put here on the apex of Wake on what was known as Peacock Point. And Battery F, I think it was, or excuse me, Battery L, was located here on Wilkes Island at Cuckoo Point. And then Battery B was on Peel Island, right up here on what was known as Cuckoo Point. And the scheme of that defense was pretty much laid out by a Colonel Pickett in 1939, who had been the CEO of the Marine Barracks in Pearl Harbor.
Yeah.
And he had come out and made that survey, and they pretty much followed it. Likewise, the anti-aircraft batteries, of which you were a member, were located with 4-gun batteries of anti-aircraft here with Battery E. And
Lieutenant Lewis, I believe.
Right. And Battery F was co-located very close to that on Wilkes. And then your battery, which was Battery D, was over here on Peel, kind of co-located right there with Battery B. Now, putting all this equipment out, I don't think you had any prime movers, for example, to move those weapons. How was that done? Do you recall?
I believe it was with the old Rio trucks.
Well, that Rio trucks had been the prime mover, or some cases tractors. Did you bring some Rio trucks then with you to help move some of that equipment?
As well as I can remember, yes.
Yep.
There were a few.
Now, the Morrison-Knudsen Company, of course, had a lot of heavy equipment, but
Yeah.
they had priorities to get that air base built, so they couldn't do much for you, I don't think.
No, but they were very cooperative to do what they could.
Uh-huh.
Nice people.
Now, was each gun crew responsible then for emplacing its own guns?
Yes, and sandbagging them in.
Right. In the case of the Coast Artillery, they had to dig a pit about 4 to 6 feet deep, 16 feet square, down, and then lay 12-inch, 12 by 12 railroad ties across those, and then they had to bolt those guns into that. That must have been quite a task. And then sandbag it all.
Right.
And likewise, you had to put your guns out, and then, of course, you had those mounts that could be spread eagled, as we showed before, for some stability, but then you had to also sandbag all of that. So that must have been quite a task.
Yes, it was. We got used to handling those, we called the outriggers, when you set the gun in place, you open these outriggers.
So what was your working day like throughout then after you arrived and kind of through September when you were putting all those guns in place?
You know, the best of my memory, it was not the normal work day. We started before that. Maybe we had what we called an early chow, early breakfast, and then went right out on the gun positions. I'd say we were out there beginning to work by 7.
And how did you get out to that gun position on Peel? Were you transported by trucks?
Yes, we had the old Rio trucks.
Okay. And at the end of the working day, were you able to have shower? Was there sufficient water? What was the water supply like there?
Very limited. As I recall, the showers were all salt water, water drawn out of the lagoon.
And you had a water tower right there at Camp,
Yes,
at Camp 1.
Camp 1.
Right.
It was also a sentry post. I remember standing watch up there on one occasion in a terrific storm. I had to tie myself in to the railing up there.
Did you? Now, you had no infantry with that defense battalion per se,
No.
but every Marine had his own, either a service rifle,
Yes.
an 03 Springfield, or a Browning automatic rifle.
Actually, I had a BAR.
Well, initially, though, you had your
Yes,
03.
I had the 03.
Now,
I
was this-
remember the number.
You remember the number?
Right.
What was the number?
990159.
And was this the same weapon that was issued to you when you were a recruit?
San Diego in 1939.
Yeah, it was customary for Marines in those days to take their weapon on to the next duty station no matter where
Oh,
they
yes.
went. And so
Yes.
they kind of
You
even...
were married to it.
Yep.
It was.
All right. Now, tell us about what NCO there in Battery D that you kind of particularly remember.
Well, Big Wright was the main mainstay, and he wouldn't be allowed in today's Corps. He's too heavy. But he was a very fine staff NCO. He did a wonderful job.
And he kind of ran the whole battery,
Yes,
particularly if
right.
some of it's through its fire direction center.
Mm-hmm.
Some reports I've read, he weighed over 300 pounds. Can you
I
validate
believe
that?
that. I believe that. He was an enormous man.
Yeah. An old-time Marine, though, I guess, and
Oh,
probably
yeah.
had a lot of
Yes.
a lot of service.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what occupied most of your time through September.
Mm-hmm.
And then on its fifth trip to Wake Island, the William Ward Burroughs. Could I have that next picture of the William Ward Burroughs?
Mm-hmm.
Arrived. And this ship brought 48 more construction workers for the Morrison Knudsen.
Mm-hmm.
And they also brought a 38-year-old balding Marine major.
Right. Major Devereaux.
Major Devereaux.
JPS Devereaux.
Can I see the next slide? And let's take a look at Major Devereaux.
Yeah, he was not a real impressive-looking guy, but he was very intelligent, a very fine officer.
Now, he was no stranger to the 1st Defense Battalion, was he? I mean,
No.
you kind of went back with him quite a ways, right?
Yes, a lot. I remember in field trips, he would come out riding a horse.
What, is this when you were training in San Diego?
In Kearney Mesa, yeah.
In Kearney Mesa.
Mm-hmm.
And
Actually, he was well-liked, highly respected.
he was Colonel Bones, who was the first commanding officer of the 1st Defense Battalion, executive officer.
As I remember, yes.
Now, executive officers are expected to kind of, if you play the Mutt and Jeff, and the commanding officer can be
That's
kind of
right.
a nice guy, it's the exec has got to play the role of being
in between.
the taskmaster.
Right.
And did he do that? I understand he
Yes,
did
he
pretty
did.
well.
He did his job very well.
Okay.
Everybody liked and respected him, as I recall.
So he relieved Major Hone, who got back on the Brewster, or the actually the William Ward Burroughs, rather, and went back to Honolulu. And the reason Major Devereaux had not come out initially was because he had been out with a part of the 1st Defense Battalion on either Johnston or Palmyra, and so that was why you had an acting commander.
As I remember, that's correct.
How did your life change, if any, now that Major Devereaux was back there after the 28th of October?
Well, there was a sense of urgency, and you realized that he had been indoctrinated that way, and he expected the maximum effort out of everybody, and he got it. He was highly respected.
Well, according to his book, he was pretty critical of what the Pioneer Detachment had not achieved in its 8 weeks out there. He thought the defenses were in a pretty sorry state, actually.
Yes, as I recall.
In his book, that's the way he described it. And so he kind of picked up the pace a little bit, did he not?
Right.
You started working...
Yeah, our work day was a little longer than it used to be.
It was 12 to 16 hours, according to the official history.
But he was right there with us. He was...
And 7 days a week, I believe.
I believe it was.
Yeah. So he was really keeping... Now, and it was all really hard labor. I mean, you were doing
Oh, yeah.
filling
Filling
sandbags,
sandbags
digging with very, very little in the way of engineering equipment.
And handling those guns was a big job in itself. It had outriggers that had to be spread out and put in place every time you emplaced the gun.
Yeah. Now, after he did arrive and he started to pick up the pace and everything else, and was He obviously had had a lot of briefings when he was back in Hawaii.
Yes,
And
he
he
must
knew
have.
that perhaps war was drawing closer. So that's why he wanted to get, he was well prepared as he could.
Yeah, he relayed the sense of urgency.
Yeah, and he
even
believed,
as snuffies in the rear rank, we realized that it was urgent.
and he believed that the more you sweat in peace, the less you bled in war. So
That's
I
right.
think. Now, compounding his efforts, however, I don't know if you remember this, was the fact that there were a number of B-17s that were being passed through Wake. Actually, they were originating on the West Coast and flying from Hawaii to Midway to Wake to Guam to Rabaul and then
That's
into
right.
Clark Field in the Philippines.
I
This is during the
stood,
buildup of the by Army Air Corps B-17s.
I stood watch on those a number of times.
Right. And the big task they used the Marines was to refuel them, and they would come in increments of 9 airplanes in each of the flights over a period of time. And each airplane required, I think, 3,000 gallons of fuel. And the only way to fuel these, can we have that next slide, was to hand pump them out of 50-gallon drums that had been scattered around the airfield.
That's right.
And so Marines were used for this purpose. And that really kept you away from your primary task of preparing your fortifications.
That's true.
When those planes were passing through. Moreover, as I understand it, the planes had to be off Wake by midnight because they had to fly over the Japanese mandated islands during hours of darkness. And that's why they had
Yes,
there was
I remember.
a lot of urgency in doing that. So that took a lot of time. Now, in his capacity as the island commander, Major Devereaux also played host to Ambassador Saburo Kurusu, who was being sent to Washington, D.C.
Yes,
as a special envoy. And
I never saw the man, but I remember.
Yeah, and he was on the eastbound China Clipper that came through. I think it was somewhere in 16th October or something like that.
Sounds right.
But what was your sense about what was going on and the likelihood of war? Was there talk about that among you or your comrades?
No, as I recall, we were pretty well kept in the dark.
Yeah.
We knew there was a sense of urgency about something, but details or what the threat was, we didn't. It was not communicated to us.
Yeah, and Caruso came through on that second week of November, as I look at my notes now. And then in the end of, or about mid-November, the commander of the 14th Naval District, which was back in Hawaii, declared that Wake Island now had a naval aviation air station. And even though the building of it had only been about halfway,
Yes.
in terms of its facility.
Yeah, it didn't have. The
there was still
runway was just crushed
Right.
coral rock.
Lots of things yet to do. But nevertheless, once they declared that, and they couldn't have a Marine ground officer in charge of a naval air station, so the Navy corrected this by sending out a new commander for the island.
Cunningham, I believe.
And can I have the next slide? And this person, excuse me, I want to go back to this. This is the USS Castor.
Oh, yeah.
And that came in just when you were still doing all this refueling at the end of October. But they brought with you a lot of welcome reinforcements.
Yes.
This
I
was
remember
another
that.
190 Marines from the 1st Defense Battalion and 9 more officers. So they were to help you kind of put those guns in, but also some of them, it took them 3 days to offload, and then they weren't even able to unpack their sea bags at Tent Camp 1 until they were also involved in refueling operations, if that's right.
Yes.
Yep. May I have the next slide, please? And here was the new commander, Commander
Cunningham.
Cunningham, Winfield Scott Cunningham, who arrived on the seaplane tender Wright just on the 28th of November. And he relieved Major Devereaux as the island commander. I don't know if you were even aware of that you had a new commander on the island, or that it had shifted to Navy command.
No, I wasn't aware.
Yeah. Now, in addition, the Wright also brought 10 Navy officers and about 58 Navy enlisted. This was to be the subunit to run the Naval Air Station, plus they ran small boats for you there in the channel. And they also brought one officer, and I think it was about 50 Marine enlisted from Marine Air Group 21 that had been embarked from Eva Airfield there in Hawaii, outside of Pearl Harbor, come on the Wright, and they were to serve as the ground crew for another element that was scheduled to arrive.
Right.
So as we kind of begin to approach the eve of World War II and in the last weeks of peace, the last two final elements of the forces that were assigned to defend Wake, one I'm sure you probably was not even aware of, were two submarines. And this was the submarines Triton and Tambor.
I heard that later on, yeah. But at the time, I wasn't aware of it.
Right. And they were sent out in order to conduct war patrols on some of the approaches to Wake Island. And as we will see when we get into the battle, they were not very effective, actually. And they could only surface at night and be able to communicate.
Yes.
And then the last element, I'm sure, is one that you do remember. And can we have that next slide, please? And this was a squadron of these F-4, 12 of these F-4F Grumman fighter airplanes, but could also carry a small bomb load as well.
Right.
And this squadron was VMF 211 that had flown out on the 28th from their field at Effa and landed on Admiral Halsey's flagship Enterprise, and that formed up as Task Force 8 and headed out towards Wake for the purpose of transporting this squadron to it. The pilots later talked about they didn't have any notion of where they were heading. They were still, all they had were their flight suits.
That's right.
That's
I became good friends with two of them, Major Froiler and Theron.
Right.
Frank Theron.
And,
good men.
And so they took a 5-day transit, and when they were 200 miles out, they had flown in about 10 PPYs, and then they sent down from Midway, and about one of these PPYs led the squadron into Wake, and they arrived on the 4th of December, I think, when they arrived. So on the 5th, they had everything pretty well dug in, and about half of your positions were dug in, camouflaged, had landlines out. And Major Devereaux decided to run a mock alert drill on Saturday the 6th. And he does that in the morning. And it went so well that he decided to give all of you kind of a rope yarn Sunday, as we used to call it, a period of relaxation from Saturday until Reveille on Monday the 8th.
Right.
Now, VMF 211 still had a lot of work to do. There were no revetments or anything like that. And Major Putman, can we see the next slide, please? Major Putman, who was the squadron commander, was busy getting his folks organized there on Wake. But you had a day and a half. Admiral Cunningham decided to give his sailors a time off, and even Dan Teeters decided to give his men a day off. And so that was kind of the last respite.
Yes.
Before on the closing days of at Wake Island. Do you remember how you spent those days, Charlie? Or that
I don't.
36
I don't
hours, I guess.
Probably sleeping.
But someone, I guess, fishing in the lagoon and kind of relaxed, played cards, I'm sure, and wrote letters and things like that.
Yeah.
And then if you'll remember, can I see the next slide, that on Sunday afternoon, the Pan American eastbound flight had arrived late Sunday afternoon, and his passengers were disembarked and they were getting ready to fly off early for Guam the next morning. Now, if anybody had taken a nose count of Wake's human population, they would have found that it was consisted of 1,742 souls, all males. There were no females. 1,218 were civilians. 27 were with the were Americans and Guamanians who were part of the Pan American employees, and 1,146 were employees with the Morrison Knudsen. And the total military strength was 524. And most of that, of course, was built around the 15 officers and 373 enlisted of the 1st Defense Battalion, and VMF 211, 12 officers and 49 enlisted men. And then there was an Army Air Corps captain along the 6th enlisted.
I remember that.
That had run a van for the B-17s.
Yes,
and that was the total strength at Wake Island on the eve of war, when war broke out. So on the next segment, Charlie, we'll step into those fatal days of December 8th on Wake Island.
Sounds good.
Very good. Thank you for being here. I
It's
enjoyed
my
talking with
pleasure.
you and hearing your reminiscences.
My pleasure.
This is you. You've been ripped off, or you've spotted a scam. Don't keep it to yourself. Take it to the Federal Trade Commission by filing a complaint. What kind of complaint? The Federal Trade Commission is the nation's consumer protection agency. So if a business doesn't deliver on its promises, or if someone cheats you out of your money, the Federal Trade Commission wants to hear about it.
I bought a phone card with 350 minutes of calling time, but it cut me off after 20.
I'm getting bills for things I didn't buy. I think someone stole my identity.
Letter said I won a sweepstakes, but I had to wire money to cover the taxes. I did, and never heard from them again.
I responded to an ad online for a free trial offer, but then I started seeing charges for it every month.
I thought the email was from someone who saw my resume and wanted to hire me, but they asked for my bank account number. I reported it to the Federal Trade Commission.
Telling the Federal Trade Commission helps us stop rip-offs, scams, and fraudsters. Your complaints matter here. To file a complaint, just go to ftc.gov/complaint. Click on the link to the Federal Trade Commission Complaint Assistant and answer the questions. Or call 1-877-FTC-HELP. That's all there is to it. If you've been ripped off or scammed, complain to the Federal Trade Commission. It can help put the bad guys out of business.